Greetings, everyone. My name is Judd Hendrix, and I want to welcome you to Interfaith Paths to Peace, Cultivating a Soul-Centric City program. Every Tuesday from 12 to 1 o'clock, we host a program on cultivating a soul-centric path and practitioners here in Louisville. What does it mean? What does it look like? What do we need in order to create a developmental path and the practices for holistic development? And we're taking a soul-centric developmental wheel created by Bill Plotkins that takes different life stages. And so this month in April, we've been looking at children and how do we nurture children as a community. And today we're having an exciting conversation with Dr. Brad Wigger. Dr. Wigger is a professor at the Presbyterian Seminary and a longtime friend who I have followed his work and been very appreciative of. So we're in for a treat in our conversation today. Unlike a lot of our other programs, this is kind of just a conversation with Brad and I. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, you're welcome to put in a question or a comment into the comment section. And those of you that are joining us on Zoom, you'll be invited into the conversation as we go. You're also, if you want to use the chat box, you're welcome to do that as well. So I want to jump in and welcome Dr. Wigger. Brad, thank you so much for being with us. I'm going to do a little bit of introduction for Brad. He's got a really amazing bio. He is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church USA and has served churches in Colorado, Wisconsin, and Mexico. He has a social work, has a social work degree and special education, and he taught at Princeton Theological Seminary. In addition to that, being the faculty member at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, he also directed the Center for Congregations and Family Ministry, and that was also supported by Second Presbyterian Church, and that's where I got to know Brad. Originally, I was a pastor at Second Pres, and he came in and was doing some really amazing work in family ministry, and we may get into a little of that conversation as we go. He is also the director and has edited the Journal for Family Ministry and co-edited Families and Faith book series from Josie Bass. He's provided leadership education opportunities through conferences and workshops and taught and continues to teach courses focused on children and families, child advocacy, practical theology, writing, and the church's teaching ministry. Dr. Wigger has authored several articles and books, some that we'll get into today. His most recent publication is a picture book for children called Thank You, God, which was preceded by Original Knowing How Religion, Science, and the Human Mind Point to the Irreducible Depth of Life. And he's also got another book on a prayer book for families, and has published a lot of articles in the Family Journal that he also was an editor for. He's just finished, and this is kind of the main part of our conversation, a book that looks at imaginary friends, children and their experience of having imaginary friends. And so we're going to talk some more specifically about that book and the research that he's done. Brad, thanks so much for being on. You have such a beautiful, rich history. And the topic that we're specifically looking at, that Brad and I are going to explore, is why is it important to cultivate the religious and mythic imagination of children? Why are these images, symbols, religious imagination meaningful and important in children's development, their cognitive development, their psychological development? And how can we help encourage that? And I was telling Brad before, I'm really interested in, for those that may not be in a religious tradition, or they may be agnostic or atheist, or the spiritual but not religion, why would it be important for people that may not practice a religious tradition to tend to the mythical and religious symbols that have emerged not only in our in religions but in our culture, and why is that important in children's development? So that's kind of the conversation topic for today. Brad, I want to, the first question, I've got four questions for you. First, how did you get into this work? Tell us a little bit about your story and why this area of work became so important to you.
Yeah, well, first, Judd, thanks for inviting me. I can talk about this stuff forever, except that today I have a class, so
Yes, we'll be
I'm
done
limited
so you
that
can get to
way.
your class.
Yeah, but yeah, I've appreciated our friendship and our working relationships both over the last 25 years, I think it is now.
We're old,
Um,
Brad.
so yeah, that's right. Um, so the question of how I got into this and kind of the story behind it, in some ways it goes back 25 years, really more about 30 years. Um, we have two children, Jane and I do, and children who are not children now. And the 5 years before I came here in 1997, and the 5 years before that, I was pretty much a stay-at-home dad that whole time. Um, and that had and I think that was in the bio that you posted. But I think it's almost impossible to overestimate how important that has been in my career, let alone my personal life and my relationship with the kids. Um, it, it was it was challenging at the time because really what I wanted to do was be out there teaching, but the jobs weren't out there. So Jane served as a pastor, and I stayed home with the kids, and I had a lot of time with young children at that point, and um, it really got me. At that point, I had done my PhD, and a big chunk of my work was around developmental psychology. Um, so we're talking 30 years ago now. And what I began to see is that the picture of children that I was taught and even helped teach as a TA and that kind of thing um, didn't quite fit the reality in front of me, my own children. Um, and some of that began, and how I got particularly into the imagination side of this was that our daughter, Cora, at 3 years old, had an imaginary friend. And the friend's name was Crystal. And Crystal had a last name too, Malaver. And it was quite entertaining to to um, watch her interact with this friend that nobody else could see. We would, I would buckle her into the car when we were going to the grocery store. Sometimes we'd set an invisible plate full of invisible cookies next to her at snack time. But anyway, so it started just with pure intrigue with a child's imagination, in this case, my own child. Um, and the developmental picture at that point was pretty much a kind of suspicion of something like an imaginary friend. If you went to Dr. Spock, he would say, well, it might be okay, but be careful, because it might be a sign of something gone haywire. Well, there were no other signs of Cora going haywire. So um, I began to think, this just doesn't seem right. So I was intrigued by it then. But then it took another 15, 20 years before I was in a position to really do anything about that. And about, I think it was 2009, I got a grant through Oxford University to be part of a program to develop a research project. And I proposed ahead of time that I study children with imaginary friends. And the project was accepted. I met with other scholars who were doing other interesting projects, all related to how not just how children, but how people think in relationship to religion. It was a project called the Cognitive Science of Religion. So we were putting together cognitive science, cognitive psychology with real human beings, and in my case, with children. And all that led to my being able to interview, at first in Louisville, 40 children who all had imaginary friends. And it was such a delightful project. And I gathered the stories about the friends, everything from all kinds of surprises, from children having multiple friends to some children had a friend that we dubbed them shapeshifters, because they would transform from one shape to another. Maybe one day that they're a dinosaur, another day they're an angel, one day Jeff is a boy and likes karate, and another day Jeff is Jeffette and she likes pearls. And just all kinds of variability going on, which is one of the punchlines coming out of that I think that one of the important aspects of tending to children's imagination and their development is that it can have a profound effect on adults, and maybe loosen our own imaginations and ways of thinking about the world a good bit. Anyway, I'll wrap up that part of it. Basically ended up interviewing 40 children about imaginary friends and ran some cognitive tests on them. I reported all that back at Oxford, and that project led to a bigger grant where I got to check the results of this limited study in Louisville, Kentucky, against children in 4 other countries. So I ended up interviewing children in Kenya and Nepal and Malawi and the Dominican Republic. And that set me up to do some nice cross-cultural comparison of children, both on the cognitive tests and also on, at that point, nobody had done anything like, do children in these countries really different from Louisville, Kentucky, do they even have imaginary friends? Is it purely a cultural thing, or is it something, a kind of potential in children developmentally that still might need some support or could be discouraged as well? So that's how I began. Maybe I should stop there and see if you have questions.
Yeah. Well, the first, what did you find? Like, how are children using imaginary friends to, what are they doing there cognitively? And what do children do with this imagination process? I'm assuming that the kind of religious imagination and mythic imagination is a similar kind of cognitive process, or it's functioning psychologically in a similar way. What did you find? Why are children doing that? What's going on psychologically?
Yeah, a couple of different things. I think you're right that there is at least an overlap between children's imaginary friends and children's religious imaginations. I've since then been interviewing children particularly about their religious beliefs and practices. So I have a lot to compare to, and I'm still in the middle of that project. What I found, or I found many things. One had to do with the flexibility of children's imaginations, and I think that has a lot to do with learning. 2, I found that children understood the difference. One of the worries developmentally has been, let me back up a little bit. In a kind of Freudian, and Piaget relied heavily upon Freud for early childhood. Freud saw children, babies, as basically all id, all irrationality, all desire. And certainly some of that's going on in all of us and in children too. But in that kind of scheme, the imagination and fantasy represents a kind of regression into early childhood. But it seems to be, and it's not just me claiming this, it's where developmental psychology is now. That was almost upside down, that children start out with a realistic engagement with the world through their bodies, through touch and taste and the senses. And the imagination comes later, usually not till the second year of life. So like language, imagination is a developmental accomplishment. So that's really upside down. And once you've turned that upside down, then the question is, the assumption is not that an imaginary friend or other forms of fantasy, the assumption is not that some kind of regression into an earlier stage. But it probably means that this is some kind of tool helping children engage with realistically, even with the world around them. Particularly with imaginary friends, I think particularly it's helping them engage in the world of social relationships. And the odd thing is that, the upside down thing is, it tends not to, children who have at least ones I interviewed, children who have imaginary friends tend not to be the stereotype of an intensely introverted child without any friends, compensating, that would be a Freudian thing, compensating for the lack of friendship by developing an imaginary one. It was more the other way around, that these kids tended to be really social. And this would fit with our daughter as well. It's that they're so social, they have friends, but they're so social, they just make up more. And sometimes they even do it while they're playing with their regular friends as well. I found children sharing imaginary friends with their so-called real friends, siblings sharing imaginary friends. It was the opposite of a kind of loner out there. It was a kind of reflection of a deeply social life. So the other big lesson from that, and this happened in one of my very first interviews. We were interviewing a little 3-year-old. She wasn't even quite 3 yet. I think she was like 2 and 11 months. And she had 2 imaginary friends, Leah and Coda. And we didn't know that there were going to be 2. The mother that I had talked to ahead of time said that there was just Leah. But it turned out there had also been Coda, but Coda had died like 2 weeks before the interview. But the day of the interview, Coda came back. So he was part of the interview as well. Anyway, did this fairly extensive interview, learning about Leah and Coda, running some cognitive tests. And all along the way, we were giving stickers out to every time the girl did one of these tests, we'd give a sticker because kids just love stickers. So at the end of the whole thing, I asked, where are Leah and Coda now? And this little girl said, well, Leah's right over there. And she pointed across the room. And I go, oh, that's great. And I said, where's Coda? And she looked around the room and she got up from our little chairs we were sitting in, went to the doorway. We were in a classroom, went to the hallway, and she looked down the hallway and she starts going like this and motioning Coda, presumably, to come on in the room. And then she got about halfway back to our chairs, and she squatted down and she kind of whispered something to Coda, and then came to the chairs, and this little girl said, now Coda is with us here too. And I go, oh, that's great. Leah and Coda are both here now. And I said, I wonder if they would like some stickers. And she looked at me and she said, they're pretend. Like, you idiot. I know they're pretend. Why don't you know that they're pretend? And that was confirmed over and over again. Children realized, they knew they were not crazy. They knew that their invisible friends were pretend. And some children even called them their pretend friends. So again, going back to the developmental framework, that actually points to a real sophistication that children can differentiate this kind of imaginative world from the everyday, so-called real life world. So that was huge. But the lesson that I think translates over into religious imagination is that these relationships, even though the kids know that they're pretend, the relationships themselves are very real. It matters to them whether or not you disrespect Leah and Coda. If I just said to, oh, come on, that's pretend, that would be very disrespectful of the relationship that's quite real. In my mind, it'd be the same as if an adult were watching a movie or reading a novel and the main character dies or something bad happens to him, and you're crying because you've gotten attached to that character. And then somebody comes along and says, "Oh, quit crying. It's just pretend. It's just, it's just a novel. It's just a movie." I think that's how kids feel when you disrespect that relationship as well. So what that suggests is children can have a meaningful relationship with a being that's invisible.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of implications about a religious imagination in that.
Yeah. Can you, I want to come back to religious imagination and the importance it is for adults. But when you look back in children, do they start, when do they start letting go of that relationship with their imaginary friend? And does that follow a kind of a normal cognitive development where you move out of maybe even having a literal religion or believing that angels are, that you're having conversation with angels or with God? I mean, what's the developmental trajectory of when they begin not having that or integrating that into their meaning making system? Is there kind of a developmental stage that they go through?
There can be one of the punchlines, I think, from doing all this research was the tremendous variability among children. It might be children in the same family. It might be children in the same culture. But there can be tremendous variability between cultures and between individuals. So that's kind of principle number one. But there are some big patterns that probably shape whether or not a child continues to have an imaginary friend or a rich imagination, period. One of them is one of the cognitive tests we were running is something called a theory of mind test. And a theory of mind test is a real simple test to understand how children think about the thoughts of other people. So, for example, I pulled one of them out. I'd show children in Louisville. I showed children a crayon box, and I said, "Oh, what do you think's inside the box?" Crayons. And then I show them. I pour out the contents, and it turns out that there are rocks in the box instead of crayons. Oh, there are rocks in the box. That's surprising. So then I would show them the box again and say, if I showed this box to your best friend, what would your best friend think is in the box? And kids under 5 tended to say, oh, my friend will think that there are rocks in the box. The child knows that there are rocks in the box, so thinks that everybody knows rocks are in the box. But around 5 or so, at least in this culture, children begin to say, oh, no, my best friend will be fooled and think that there are crayons in the box. So I did that. I asked about God, God's perspective as well. And that was really fascinating because even 5-year-olds who said, no, my friend will be fooled. They said, but God will know that there are rocks in the box. So what that test is doing, and then I also made that, and by asking about God, it made it a kind of religious test as well. But it's probing children's points of view, how they understand the point of view of somebody else. So younger children have a harder time differentiating their own point of view from somebody else's. They can do it, but once they know something fun and surprising, like that there are actually rocks in the box, that tends to overwhelm their judgment about other people. Mm-hmm. So that's what I was exploring with them. Go back to your question again. I want to make sure I address it.
Well, I was just interested in probably where it comes from is how if our children are having imaginary friends, how do we? The larger picture is how do we cultivate. So one of the stories that I'm playing in my head, I've got a friend who's agnostic, and they're sending their child to a Catholic school, and the kid came home and had like an icon of Jesus or something, and was talking about communion and why didn't they do communion at home, or and was using this icon of Jesus as kind of a security symbol. And
Hmm.
they were really concerned about that. That like, oh my gosh, our kids becoming, they have, a lot of concern about religious ideology and other values that go with that don't necessarily support their value system. And I was shared with her that I thought that was very natural, that's what children do, that you don't necessarily have to be so concerned that they're going to grow up to to projecting this conservative or ideological fundamentalism of a religious life, because that's just what children do. And in my sense that there are probably other symbols that children are using, or stories that children are using to make meaning out of their life or to provide psychological comfort. So I guess that the question is really about how can we nurture rich environments, but not be afraid that the ideologies of these religious traditions will also be passed on.
Yeah. And I remember why I went to the theory of mind thing in the first place. And that was simply, you were asking about, is there an age? Um, and one of the things that happens when children get around 5, 6 years old and start going to school is they're going to be more conscious of other people's opinions of them. So if I'm on the playground playing with my imaginary friend and a 7-year-old comes up to me and asks me what I'm doing, and I tell them, and they tell, well, that's stupid, then I'm going to be more sensitive to that. So there is a way that can shut down a child or anybody's imagination. The connection, I think, one thing I thought of when you're asking about talking about the Jesus icon is I want to point out the relationship between especially Freud's understanding of childhood imagination or early childhood and his critique of religion. So Freud's critique of religion is that it's just the id throwing up a fantasy figure to protect us, right? And so, but what if it's not? what if the what if Freud got that upside down too? That there is something very human about creating a relationship with invisible things. Now, that invisible thing doesn't have to be a God figure. It could be a sense of something sacred going on in the world around us. It could be, I mean, he thought the earliest stage of religiosity flowing out of the id was animism. So that you think that trees might be speaking to us. Well, what if the trees are speaking to us? I mean, the worry about religion and a figure, I mean, there are things to worry about. But I don't think they have to be what Freud worried about. I'm a romantic at heart, so I'm turning everything upside down and looking at children as inspirers in many ways of my own imagination. And imagination is our main vehicle, a shared imagination with others, but it's our main vehicle to a spiritual world of things we can't see, but sense or think's meaningful. So that's how I begin to think about that.
Yeah. And, we're going to get into adult development later on this year, but, and I think a reframe, and you can help me here, but I've gotten really interested in the work of James Hillman and the work of Carl Jung, who I think did critique Freud on his kind of scientific reductionism of those images and saying, no, this is the way God or the psyche or the self speaks to us about our own growth. And also there's so much work going on now with what's called parts work or internal family systems work, where we do realize there are all these other parts in our psyches that are voices. There are other parts of us that we don't integrate, And I'm really into active imagination and dream work because I believe it's either God or myself or my larger self speaking to me about who I am. And so that when I'm in dialogue with these images, when I take them seriously, that show up in my dream world or may show up, as an art piece, and I'm in dialogue with that, there's something that gets integrated into me. I realize there's another part of me that wants to speak to me about my wholeness. And can you talk some about that, like why imagination is so important and what we lose maybe if we reduce that to just some kind of psychic phenomenon or scientific phenomenon?
Simply simply the id doing weird things to us, irrational things. By the way, that was part of it. Yeah, Jung himself is really interesting on this, because he both worked in some ways alongside of Freud's work, but he also critiqued it as well. And one of his critiques was that it isn't that we developmentally start out all id and fantasy and then develop out of that. That's where still a lot of developmental material is encouraging us to get away from the imagination, because again, that's a sign that we're little babies. But for Jung himself had invisible figures that he interacted with. He had one called Philemon, which is like an old wise man. And if you've ever looked at the more recently, the Red Book is this newly published thing about 10 years ago. That's all his active imagination. It's incredibly rich with interactions with the imaginative figures, yet nonetheless had some reality. The relationships were real and affected his life. So as I see it, folks like Hillman and Jung were really trying to retrieve the imagination, reprioritize it, help us, because it may be doing amazing things for us. And like you said, and it's multiple. It's not just one solo figure that's me, but I myself am multiple in these interesting ways. There's coherence in some way, but there's also all this wild stuff going on. Every night we throw up these figures and settings and plots and dramas. I mean, it's as if I teach a writing class, and I always point this out to the students in writing, that every night our psyches are throwing up these novels in us, and there's something in us wants to imagine relationships with characters, wants to imagine settings and scenes, and plays out these wild plots and dramas. So the same reason we go to movies or read novels, and somehow that is okay. I think those are kind of culturally acceptable versions of what could be even a wilder and more wonderful relationship with imagination.
Yeah.
Artwork as well.
Yeah. So if parents are listening in, or those that are working with children, what would you say are, how do we create rich environments, and how can we be with children in that process in a way that encourages that or supports what they're doing? Do you have any thoughts for parents and caregivers with children in religious imagination?
Well, I think my first reaction is enjoy the ride. One of my favorite things to do with my grandchildren now, 3 and 5, is we make up stories together, and they are wonderful at it. Last time we were here, we have a treehouse in our backyard from previous owners, and I was up there with the 5-year-old, and I said something about, once upon a time, we went to the mountains And then she said, no, it wasn't the mountains, it was the desert. And I said, okay, we were in the desert. And then what happened? And then she starts telling me, and then I start filling in something too. And it's this wonderful relationship of making that happens through making up a story together. Um, for me, I don't think we have to force it. I think it's more of getting out of the way, allowing it. Don't sweat it if your children are making up wild stories. Um, I think play along is one of the best things you could possibly do. And I ran into two other thoughts. I ran into wonderful parents along the way in this process who did exactly that. They take their child to the playground and push the child on the swing for a while. Then the child will want the parent to push Curious George on the swing as well, and they do that, and then the child would for a while. Anyway, it was just playing together, and it's so refreshing for the adult imagination to just kind of kick back and let all that happen. The other thing is, in especially in Malawi, Kenya, and Nepal, um, most of those children, they had interactions with their parents, but there were often many other children in the household as well. So it wasn't that kind of intentionality behind parenting was much less than what you might find around here. And yet those kids also had imaginary friends with no help from their parents, with no props. I never saw a stuffed animal in Malawi, but children still made up friends that they played with, or that they did their homework together with, or they walked home from school with, and had fun conversations with. So in a lot of ways, it's getting away from the notion that the job of parents or the job of adulthood or school, for that matter, is training the imagination out of children. I just think that's so baked into our system, our multiple systems, that we tend not to even see it.
Yeah. Well, I want to open it up. I've got some other questions, but I want to bring some of the other folks that are on Zoom into the conversation if they wish. And kind of the way I like to see do conversations is imagine them to be a unfolding story. So what's been coming up? Is there anybody on Zoom that wants to unmute yourself and either ask a question or just maybe even share what's coming up for you around children and imagination? Does anybody want to unmute themselves and jump in? This would be a good time to do that. I'll check. I don't think there's anything on Facebook. Brad, I want to. You've written some actually children's books, and you and Jane have chosen to raise your children in the Christian religious tradition. And how do you? Why did you write the children's books? What was going on in doing that? And what's the way in which you've used Christianity or the community and the religious symbols and stories to nurture your own children? And are they carrying that on? How do your children identify with that? Or how do you think they've integrated that into their becoming?
So lots of different ways. Our daughter Cora is the least involved in a Presbyterian world of all of us, though she has her own rich traditions and appreciations for a soulful life, including church as well. But David, our son, is actually a pastor, so that's why it's easy to just say, well, Jane is a Presbyterian pastor. I was ordained, and David is too. He's a pastor up in Cleveland now. So we're watching him be with his kids in the same way we were trying to be with our own kids. For us, Well, let me say that the latest project I've been involved in, and that Jane has actually been helping me with, also came from a grant from the Luce Foundation, where I began interviewing children and their parents about specifically their religious engagement. So these were all over the country and in Mexico. I've been interviewing children about church and God and why do you go to church? Do you like church? What's the best part? What's the worst part? Tell me about God. When you grow up, do you think you will want your children to go to church if you have children? These kinds of questions to really get at how they think about who God is and what church is about. And these by definition um, have been interviews with children and households that are actively engaged in churches. These have all been Christian.
Mhm.
I wanted to see, kind of to your question, why people are so engaged in church. What did they find meaningful about it? And and Jane interviewed most of the parents. Then I listened to those interviews later, transcribed them, that kind of thing. I interviewed most of the children. But for parents, almost across the board, one of the big things about why they raise their children going to church, and I think this will be true for us as well, is that they wanted them to be part of a larger community that valued love, that
Mm.
and all the stresses and strains of being a parent are made just a little bit easier if you're a part of a larger community that is meaningful to you. I mean, you can be a part of a larger community that goes haywire and is oppressive and horrible. But you can be a part of a larger community that brings out all the best of who we are as human beings, I think, with each other. Inevitably, it's some mix of both. Um, but there's something in that too, that we're learning how to live with each other, even if we're not always right to each other.
Mm.
And children express that as well. That one of the things I would ask is, do you have other friends at church? And sometimes they would name, the other 8-year-old in their Sunday school class and so on. Often they named pastors, Sunday school teachers, the lifesaver lady who hands out lifesavers in the middle of worship, and so on. That they were having relationships with adults that were meaningful to the children. So these are some powerful things that I think can happen, and we all know how wrong they can go as well.
Yeah.
Which is why people have a bad taste. Some people have bad taste in their mouth about church or any religious organization.
Yeah. One of the conversations we're going to have in June, we're looking at the young adult stage of development, kind of post-teen. And James Fowler has written a book back a while ago on stages of faith. And I remember one of the things that happened in I would call it faith development, although it felt like I was becoming agnostic at the time. I was in my philosophy class in college, and all of a sudden my critical mind started reflecting on the religious symbols that I had used to make meaning. I'd been brought up in my culture and my family and tradition. And they talk about that time when the critical mind reflects on the images or the symbols of the stories and deconstructs them. And what happened in that is that all of those images went flat for me. Like communion all of a sudden was just this crazy thing that tribal communities have done, and so all of a sudden my mind, and now when that happened, I lost connection to a meaning making system, and then I had to reimagine these symbols from a different place, a post-rational spirituality that then is influenced me all since then. But I think that's one of the developmental challenges with these religious images, is how can the critical mind then integrate them without us losing, and maybe that's just part of it, you just lose the connectionalism that religious imagination did at one point. Do you have any thoughts about that? I know we're moving kind of into adult development there.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, I do think in the end, it's an imaginative act. Your reconstruction, whatever shape that took, it happens in the imagination, maybe in conversation with other people's imaginations, but the tool for that work happens there. So why I think the imagination is so important. But I was thinking when you were talking about another great study. Oh gosh, I just lost the woman who did it, but it was a student of Piaget's and did this wonderful study with children of different age groups, where the challenge was to balance a block on a kind of there'd be something going up, and you just had to balance a block on top of it. That was the task. The trick was some of the blocks were ordinary blocks and some of the blocks were weighted on one side. So if you tried to balance it like anybody normally would start out symmetrically, it would fall off. Okay, so that was the challenge. What she found was 3 and 4-year-olds would balance the block and fall off. They'd adjust it. They figured it out. 5 and 6-year-olds over and over and over again would try to balance the block in the middle, because that's how you balance things. They had a theory of balancing that was probably pretty new. And so then they rigidly hold on to that to protect it, because it's such a new theory. 7 and 8-year-olds were like, oh, there's a trick going on here. So you adjust it. So it's the 7 and 8-year-old thing that was able to adjust their theory about how reality is supposed to be. That seems like a kind of an analogy with what you were finding out. You get this new information, and this new information, it's new and pretty fragile still, so you're still trying to consolidate it. And so then that overwhelms everything else. But over time, with some flexibility, that's the other big piece that I think imagination brings. It brings flexibility. Things can be like this, or they can be like that. Or maybe there's another wonderful study. Sorry to keep quoting these studies, but this one I think is right in the pocket of imagination. It has to do with syllogisms. Syllogism is like Socrates is mortal. All mortals will die. Will Socrates die? Yes. So, and Piaget thought you had to be at least in puberty to be able to solve these. To have the formal logic you need to solve a problem like that. And he would test that with children, and he'd say things like, Porky is a pig. All pigs bark. Does Porky bark? And kids would say, no. Little kids would say, no, pigs don't bark. So they weren't following the logic. Well, there was this other study that framed it all around imagination. So say to a 4-year-old, we're going to pretend we're going to another planet. And all this on this planet, there are pigs, and all the pigs on this planet bark. Porky is a pig on this planet. Does Porky bark? Yes. Why? Because he's a pig. But they had the logic there. The logic is there. But with the other way of wording it, it was like this was a test at school or something. But when you got into if you use children's imaginations to explore this, the other thing they did it in that kind of voice, where you're cueing to the child that we're playing a game here. And kids have they come up with all kinds of wild things in their imaginations where pigs might bark. So anyway, in all that, I think is some kind of clue to the question you were asking about how do we reintegrate and stretch ourselves And I do think the imagination is a realm in which we can do that.
Yeah. Well, Brad, I want to, before we, does anybody have any quick question before we kind of, or comment that's on Zoom? You're welcome to unmute and make that as we begin to close. Brad, I'm so thankful for, yeah, I think my vision of a soul-centric city would be that we would have adults that surround children that could have that kind of playfulness with them and invite them into that kind of religious imagination and be with them in that, in a supportive way. And so thanks for the research. Is there anything final you'd like to close with saying or bringing to attention, or any resources or any things that may be helpful for us as a community?
Well, yeah, thinking about kind of the programmatic side or policymaking side. I mean, I think this is where, in general, support of the arts and play spaces and public spaces that aren't just completely programmatic in the sense of you're telling children exactly what to do, but there's a great role for that too, with sports and art programs and so on. But I think some combination of having lots of support for that, but also for just open, playful spaces, and which implies time. I mean, that'd be my biggest. I don't give a lot of advice to parents because it's so damn hard anyway. That you don't need people telling you what to do, but in this case, it's maybe worrying a little bit less, and enjoying, giving more free, playful time, and enjoying that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, may it be so, and may it be so for us as adults, to re-engage play. We did a series last week on godly play, which is a curriculum that uses in the Christian tradition, but it was really beautiful the way you use these stories and out of our religious communities to not only to help children make meaning and deal with kind of their existential anxieties using these figures and stories within the Christian tradition, but how adults also continue to do that and make meaning.
Well, one of the best thing, yeah, I will leave you with this. Just last month, we were up visiting our grandkids and kids, and the younger one, the 3-year-old, was taking a nap. The 5-year-old isn't taking naps anymore. It's just kind of quiet time, but she wanted to go outside, and her parents were up to something, so they couldn't do it. And I said, well, I'll go outside with you, even though it was like 15 degrees out. I didn't really want to go out there in Cleveland. But anyway, she and I bundled up and we just went to their backyard. And it had rained a couple of days before, so there were icicles just everywhere. And we spent probably an hour and a half just wandering around the backyard while she was breaking icicles. I think at one point we had a little mini snowball fight, but mainly we were just wandering around the backyard, not doing much of anything at all. And it was one of the most delightful, refreshing things for me personally,
Yeah.
in a long time.
Yeah. Well, Brad, thank you so much. I so appreciate the work you're doing and bringing that to our community. Thanks for, it takes people doing that kind of heady research and then to bring that into practice. So thank you for doing that for the seminary students, but also for our Louisville community. And good to have you with us today. And thanks for the work you're doing. Eva, did you have any final question, comment?
No questions, but thank you, Brad. That was so interesting. I've read your book, of course, but it's been a while, and it just reminded me of a lot. And the imagination, importance of the imagination. I really appreciate hearing that.
Thanks, Eva. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Eva. Well, thank you all for joining us. And if you've joined us on Facebook, this will be up on our webpage as a resource. So I hope you'll check out our webpage on Interfaith Paths to Peace, and join us next week. Actually, next week we don't have a program, but we're moving into, in May, we'll be looking at rituals and rites of passages for young people, looking at Quinceañera from our Latinx tradition. We're going to be looking at different ways in which the Catholic Church does confirmation, and then an indigenous, more of a Yoruba or a Central African practice that is being reclaimed here in Louisville by Stacy Bailey Naja and Play Kids Collective, where they're taking from an African tradition, and they're in partnership with Bernheim Forest. So they're taking primarily Black teenagers down to do more of an indigenous kind of experience on the land at Bernheim. So that's a real fascinating connection that's going on. So I hope you'll join us. So that'll be on May 10th. And then on May 17th, we're looking at, spirituality and education. How certain public schools and private schools are trying to integrate a spiritual curriculum without having religious ideology. So we're going to be talking to some different schools and how they're managing bringing in a spirituality curriculum into public and private schools. So I hope you'll join us back in May for those conversations as well. Brad, blessings to you. Thanks very much. For the rest of you that have joined us, thanks for being here, and we'll stay tuned.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, Brad. Peace.
See ya.